Impossible. That's Aegis Protocol. In the heart of a forgotten diner, a billionaire CEO sat in silent refuge, mistaken by 5 hired killers as nothing more than a stray dog. Knives, chairs, and the cold promise of steel lay dormant as oblivious customers judged him a failure. But just as the shadow of violence began to stretch across the grimy floor, the clumsy waitress, a ghost in a faded apron, felt the old storm gathering behind her calm eyes, ready to unleash a technique the world had been told no longer existed. The Crossroads Diner was a place that time, and likely the health inspector had agreed to forget. It sat squat and stubborn on the edge of a lonely highway, a weary beacon in the vast, indifferent landscape. The air inside was a thick cocktail of stale coffee, sizzling grease, and the faint, sweet scent of desperation. Vinyl on the booths was cracked like old leather, revealing yellowed foam underneath, and the chrome trim on the counters had long since surrendered its shine to a permanent dullness. It was a purgatory for the transient, a home for the locals who had nowhere else to be. And in this purgatory, Eliza Vance moved like a phantom. To the casual observer, she was just part of the faded scenery. Her brown hair, escaping a loosely tied bun, framed a face that was perpetually aimed at the floor. Her movements were careful, almost hesitant, giving her the air of someone perpetually on the verge of dropping a tray. Her apron, a pale blue cloth that had seen 1,000 spills, was her shield, rendering her invisible. She looked exactly like she belonged there, serving lukewarm coffee to truckers and burnt eggs to ghosts, a woman whose ambitions had run out of gas on the highway of life. Nobody would have guessed she was anything more. But earlier that morning, as the dawn had bled purple and orange across the horizon, something had happened. A tremor had run through her carefully constructed world, making her hand shake for a single, terrifying second as she poured coffee. A man had come in, a stranger with eyes that saw too much, and sat in the corner booth. He hadn't ordered much, but he had left something behind, tucked neatly under his plate. It wasn't a generous tip. It was a scrap of paper, folded into a tight square. On it, a single stark image had been drawn in black ink, a stylized shield, the symbol of Aegis. She had burned it in the industrial kitchen sink, her heart hammering against her ribs. She watched the flames greedily lick at the paper, watched the symbol curl and blacken into ash. Her old life, the life of a commander, the life of precision and violence and secrets, was not supposed to follow her here. She had walked away from that world, had meticulously erased every trace of Commander Vance to become Eliza, the clumsy waitress. But the note was a whisper from the grave, a confirmation of her deepest fear. Someone knew. Someone had found her. Now, as the diner filled for the dinner rush, that fear was a cold knot in her stomach. Every jingle of the bell above the door was a potential threat. Her eyes, shielded by her downcast gaze, flicked constantly towards the entrance, her senses on high alert. She was waiting for the pass to walk in. The bell jingled, and Silas Thorne stepped inside. He was tall, with shoulders broad enough to suggest a life of physical labor, but he was dressed like he'd just walked off a construction site after a long shift. A faded canvas jacket, plain blue jeans worn at the knees, and heavy boots scuffed at the toes. No one, absolutely no one, would have pegged him for the CEO of Thorne Industries, a titan of technology whose net worth could swallow this entire town and several others without a trace. He didn't want the attention. That's why he was here, in this nowhere diner, 100 miles from the city's gleaming glass towers and his ever-present security detail. This was his sanctuary of anonymity. He slid into a booth, the worn vinyl sighing under his weight. His hands, large and capable, rested on the sticky tabletop. As he moved, the cuff of his jacket rode up just enough to reveal a simple silver watch. Eliza's eyes caught it from across the room. Her breath hitched. It wasn't flashy, but it was custom. The sleek, minimalist design, the unique clasp, it was a one-of-a-kind piece commissioned from a master Swiss watchmaker. A watch she knew only one man in the world would wear. Her jaw tightened, a subtle ripple of muscle along her cheek. She kept wiping the counter, her movements slow, deliberate, a mask of bored indifference. But inside, her mind was racing. She knew who he was. And if she knew, It was possible others did too. His presence here was not a coincidence. It was a complication. It was trouble. The diner buzzed with the low hum of evening chatter, the clink of forks against cheap ceramic plates. At a large table near the window, a group of 5 men sat hunched over their meals. Their voices were low, but their eyes were sharp, constantly scanning the room. They weren't locals. Their boots were too clean, their jackets too new, their postures too rigid. One of them, a man with a jagged white scar bisecting his eyebrow, whom she would later learn was called Rico, leaned back in his chair. His smirk was a predatory slash on his face, and his gaze was fixed, not so subtly, on Silas Thorne. Another, a wiry, twitchy man named Jinx, kept glancing at the door, a nervous energy radiating from him. The other 3 were mountains of muscle, their laughter too loud, their hands never still. Eliza saw it all, the way they sat with their backs to the wall, giving them a clear view of all exits, the way they moved in concert, a pack of wolves trying to blend in with sheep, mercenaries. She'd seen their kind 100 times before, in 100 different godforsaken places. The worn fabric of the dishcloth protested under the pressure of her whitening knuckles, but her face remained a perfect, placid blank. At the counter, a woman with blood-red nails and a purse that screamed designer turned to her friend and whispered, her voice a stage whisper designed to carry, "Look at that guy in the booth. What's he doing here? Looks like he took a wrong turn off the poverty line." Her friend, a blonde with a spray tan and a laugh like a screeching tire, snorted. "Probably can't afford a real restaurant. Check out those boots. I think my gardener has better ones." The words floated through the diner, sharp and mean. Alexander Silas didn't look up. He simply flipped open the greasy menu, his finger tracing the list of specials, his hand perfectly steady. Eliza watched him, her eyes narrowing slightly. He didn't react. Not a flinch, not a sideways glance. Most men, even the toughest, would have at least shifted in their seat, their pride pricked. He didn't. He was either deaf or disciplined. Eliza bet on the latter. One of the mercenaries, Jinx, the wiry one with a shaved head and a cheap gold chain, stood up. He swaggered past Silas's table and accidentally bumped it hard. The water glass wobbled precariously, spilling a small puddle onto the tabletop. "Oh, my bad," Jinx said, his voice dripping with faux apology. "Didn't see you there, pal. This place is for regular folks, you know? Not whatever you are." The other mercenaries chuckled, their eyes locked on Silas, waiting. They were baiting him, testing his response. The diner grew quieter as other customers turned to watch the unfolding drama. Silas finally looked up. His gaze was steady, his eyes a calm, deep gray. "No problem," he said. His voice was quiet, even, without a hint of anger or fear. Jinx blinked, momentarily thrown off by the lack of reaction. A flicker of confusion crossed his face before he recomposed it into a sneer and walked back to his table. The red-nailed woman at the counter, Brenda, laughed loudly. "What a pushover," she declared to her friend, Tiff, making no effort to keep her voice down, didn't even stand up for himself. A young couple at a nearby table decided to join in, their voices sharp with the casual cruelty of youth. The guy, a cocky 20-something in a backward baseball cap, leaned toward his girlfriend. "Bet he's one of those guys who talks big online but lives in his mom's basement." His girlfriend, chewing gum and scrolling through her phone, giggled without looking up. "Yeah, look at his jacket. Did he pull it out of a dumpster?" Their laughter was raw and careless, and other customers nodded along, smirking, happy to be part of the winning side in a conflict that cost them nothing. Eliza's fingers paused on the counter, her knuckles white for just a second. She picked up a coffee pot and moved toward a table, her steps measured, her face impassive. But her eyes, for a fraction of a second, flicked back to Silas. He was still, his face an unreadable mask, but his thumb was making a small repetitive motion, brushing against the edge of his unique silver watch. It was a small, unconscious gesture, a tell, a crack in his armor of calm. It was enough for her to notice, enough for her to know that he wasn't as unaffected as he appeared. He wasn't scared, he was controlled, he was holding back. The diner's manager, a sweaty man named Carl with a mustache that looked like it was trying to escape his face, leaned over the counter as Eliza passed. "Don't get involved, kid," he hissed, his eyes darting nervously towards the mercenaries. "That guy in the booth is trouble. Let him deal with his own mess. Eliza didn't answer. She just picked up a fresh pot of coffee and walked over to Silas's booth. Her hands were perfectly steady now as she poured him a cup, the dark, steaming liquid filling the white ceramic mug. As she did, her eyes, seemingly focused on her task, flicked to the mercenaries' table. One of them, the largest one, was subtly slipping something from under his jacket. A knife, maybe. She could tell by the slight, awkward movement of his shoulder, the way his hand stayed close to his side, shielding the motion. She set the coffee pot down on the table. Then, with a movement that looked entirely accidental, her elbow knocked a full glass of ice water directly into the lap of the twitchy mercenary, Jinx. He leaped up with a curse, his hand jerking away from the hidden blade he was about to draw. "Clumsy idiot," he snapped, brushing furiously at his soaked pants. The red-nailed woman, Brenda, laughed again, louder this time. "Wow, this place really hires the best, huh? Can't even pour water right." The blonde, Tiff, joined in, her voice shrill. Maybe she's new, or just stupid. The diner rippled with snickers as heads turned to stare at Eliza, the clumsy waitress who was now the center of a different kind of attention. She didn't say a word. She simply grabbed a towel from her apron, handed it to Jinx, and looked him dead in the eye. "My mistake," she said. Her voice was soft, but it was as steady as a rock. There was something in her gaze, a flat, cold stillness that made him pause. His smirk faltered for half a second. He saw something there he didn't understand, something that didn't fit with the clumsy waitress act. He snatched the towel from her hand and sat down, muttering under his breath. An older man in a flannel shirt, sitting alone with a half-eaten burger, decided to pile on. His voice was a gruff, bitter rumble that carried across the diner. A girl like that probably dropped out of high school. No wonder she's stuck working in a dump like this. He shook his head as if he were passing a final judgment on her entire existence. The couple nearby laughed. The guy in the baseball cap pointed at Eliza's apron. "Yeah, look at those stains. Bet she doesn't even own a washing machine." The words hit like small, sharp stones. Eliza's hand stilled on the towel she was holding, her fingers curling just slightly. She turned away, her face a blank canvas, and started wiping down another table. But as she moved, her eyes caught a flicker of movement in a faded photograph on the wall. It was an old picture of a school awards ceremony, showing a young girl in a crisp uniform standing proud. It wasn't her, but it could have been. A lifetime ago. Her lips pressed into a thin, hard line, and she kept moving, the rhythmic swipe of her cloth, the only sign of her composure. Silas watched the entire exchange, his eyes narrowing just a fraction. He took a slow sip of his coffee, his mind piecing things together. The waitress wasn't just clumsy. That spill had been too perfect, too timely. It had disrupted the mercenary's movement, exposed his intent. It was either the luckiest accident in the world, or it was a deliberate, calculated act. He looked at her again, really looked at her, past the stained apron and tired posture, and saw a flicker of something else, a ghost of discipline, a shadow of strength. Eliza turned away, her back to the room, but her fingers brushed the edge of her apron pocket. Tucked inside was a small, heavy metal spoon. Not a weapon, not really, but in her hands, anything could be. She had learned that lesson young, back when she was still Olivia Ningguan, before she became Eliza Vance, before she had disappeared into this life of grease and anonymity. A memory flickered, sharp and unwelcome, a long, polished dining table, her father at its head, his voice firm but kind. "Olivia, you don't need to prove yourself to anyone. You stand tall, and you let the world figure it out, or not. Their judgment is a reflection of them, not you." She had been 12 years old, her hair in braids, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The room had been full of powerful people, all watching her, expecting her to act like the heiress she was. She hadn't. She had just sat there, quiet, watching them back. The memory faded as she continued her work, the hum of the diner a dull roar in her ears. The insults and judgments kept coming, a relentless drizzle of casual cruelty, but Eliza barely heard them now. Her focus had narrowed. It was no longer on the ignorant customers. It was on the 5 men who were not here for the food, and the 1 man they were here for. The storm was no longer gathering. It had arrived. The splash of cold water had done more than soak a mercenary's trousers. It had shattered the diner's fragile peace. The low buzz of conversation had died, replaced by a thick, watchful silence, punctuated only by the sizzle of the grill and Jinx's muttered curses. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Rico's eyes, cold and hard as river stones, bored into Eliza, then shifted back to Silas, his expression darkening. The test had been interrupted, but the experiment was far from over. Brenda, the woman at the counter, broke the silence with a theatrical sigh. "Honestly, you can't find good help anywhere," she said, loud enough for the entire diner to hear. She took a delicate sip of her diet soda, her red nails clicking against the glass. First, the tramp in the corner, now the incompetent waitress. This place is a real magnet for losers. Gus, the man with the beer gut, chuckled into his half-empty mug. "You get what you pay for," he grumbled, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. His eyes, small and resentful, scanned Silas. Some people just float through life expecting a handout, never learn to pull their own weight, end up in places like this, causing trouble for honest folks. He took a hearty swig of beer, as if his pronouncement had earned him the drink. The judgment, so freely given, was a poison seeping into the atmosphere. Silas felt it press down on him, a physical weight. Years of commanding boardrooms, of negotiating multi-billion-dollar deals, of shaping the very future of technology, and here he was, reduced to a caricature of failure by a handful of strangers in a greasy spoon. A part of him, the proud, powerful CEO, wanted to rise. He wanted to pull out his phone, make one call, and have the entire world of these people dismantled before they finished their meals. He could buy this diner and fire the manager. He could discover where Brenda worked and have her contract terminated. He could trace Gus's employer and become his biggest client, just for the satisfaction of ending his career. But he crushed the impulse. That was Alexander Thorne. Tonight, he was Silas, a ghost, a nobody. This anonymity was the prize he sought, and the price of that prize was absorbing the contempt of the world he had tried to escape. He kept his eyes on his menu, but the words blurred. He was acutely aware of every whisper, every smirk. He felt the weight of their collective gaze, and it was heavier than any boardroom pressure he had ever faced. Eliza, meanwhile, moved with a feigned air of penitence. She retrieved a mop from the back, her head bowed, but beneath the mask of a flustered waitress, a cold, analytical mind was at work. She wasn't just observing, she was calculating. 5 hostiles. Rico is the leader, tactical. Jinx is the trigger, impulsive. The other 3 are muscle, predictable. Primary target is Thorne. Secondary threat is civilian panic. She noted the exits, the potential weapons on each table, a steak knife, a heavy glass sugar dispenser, a scalding coffee pot. The entire diner had transformed in her mind from a place of work into a tactical map, a field of engagement. Her manager, Carl, intercepted her near the kitchen doors, his face slick with sweat. "I told you not to get involved," he whispered, his voice a frantic hiss. "Look what you did. Now they're all riled up. Just stay in the back. Let them sort it out. I don't want my place smashed up." Eliza looked at him, her expression blank. "Someone has to clean up the water, Carl," she said, her voice betraying nothing. She pushed past him, her focus entirely on the unfolding situation. His cowardice was a known variable, already factored into her equation. Rico decided it was time to escalate. The subtle approach had failed. He stood, the legs of his chair scraping loudly against the linoleum, a sound that made half the customers flinch. He and his men moved as one, a coordinated wave of intimidation, and surrounded Silas's booth. "All right, playtime's over," Rico said, his voice low but carrying a distinct menace that cut through the diner's remaining hum. He leaned forward, planting his scarred knuckles on the table. "You owe us, man. Don't play dumb. We know you've got the cash." The lie was smooth, practiced, designed for a public audience, and the audience bought it, hook, line, and sinker. "Told you," Gus muttered triumphantly to the man at the next table. "A deadbeat." Brenda shook her head, her voice now dripping with a fake, syrupy pity. "Some people just don't know when to pay up. It's so embarrassing to watch." Silas looked up, his calm exterior finally showing a hairline crack, a muscle feathered in his jaw. His eyes met Rico's, and for the first time that evening, a flicker of the true Alexander Thorne, the man who commanded empires, surfaced. "I don't owe you anything," he said, his voice quiet but laced with steel. Rico laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Is that so?" He leaned in closer, his breath smelling of stale cigarettes. "My boss seems to think differently, and he's not a patient man." To punctuate his point, he shot his hand out and grabbed the front of Silas's worn jacket, yanking it hard enough to tear the collar. "Maybe we need to take a walk outside and have a more persuasive conversation." As the fabric ripped, a woman in a flashy leopard print coat, who had been watching with rapt attention, decided it was her moment to contribute. She stood up, her heels clicking on the floor, and pointed a long, manicured finger at Silas. "You're embarrassing yourself, honey," she declared, her voice loud and performative, as if she were the star of a reality show. "If you can't pay your debts, you shouldn't be in public places, acting all quiet and mysterious. It's pathetic." The other customers nodded, some even murmuring their agreement. It was entertainment. The quiet man's humiliation was their evening show. The woman then turned her scorn on Eliza, who was now standing a few feet away, mop in hand. "And you," she sneered, looking Eliza up and down. "Sweetheart, you better stay out of this. Nobody needs a wannabe hero in a dirty apron." Eliza's hand tightened on the wooden handle of the mop for a split second. She looked at the woman, her eyes as cold and empty as a winter sky. "I'm just doing my job," she said, her voice low and flat. The woman faltered, her smug expression faltering for a beat, before she tossed her hair and sat down, muttering, "Whatever, loser." The crowd was now firmly on the side of the aggressors. They saw a group of wronged men and a deadbeat who refused to pay. The narrative was simple, satisfying, and required no critical thought. Kayla, the teenager with the phone, had been filming the entire time. Her screen was a detached window into the scene, turning real people into digital characters. "Oh my God, this is getting real," she narrated in a hushed, excited voice for her online followers. "This guy is totally gonna get beat up. The waitress is useless. LOL." She zoomed in on Silas's face, capturing his stoic expression, his torn collar. She was not documenting an injustice. She was producing content. Silas felt the lens of the phone like a physical touch. He was now not just a man in a diner, but a spectacle being broadcast to an unseen, uncaring audience. The humiliation was no longer contained within these four walls. His hands, which had been resting on the table, slowly retracted, curling into tight fists under the lip of the table where no one could see them. He was a caged lion, poked and prodded by children who had no idea of the danger they were in. He looked at Eliza. She was standing perfectly still, her posture relaxed, the mop held loosely in her hands. But he saw it again, the utter lack of fear in her eyes. She wasn't watching him with pity. She was watching his attackers with an unnerving, professional calm. She was assessing them. And in that moment, Silas Thorne, a man who trusted almost no one, felt an inexplicable, illogical flicker of something akin to hope. He didn't know who she was, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. She was not just a waitress. The tension in the booth had reached its breaking point. Rico tightened his grip on Silas's jacket, preparing to haul him to his feet. The crowd leaned forward, hungry for the climax. This was the moment, the point of no return. The world had passed its judgment, and the sentence was about to be carried out. Rico's knuckles were white where he gripped Silas's torn jacket. The air in the diner had become so thin it was hard to breathe. The moment was stretched taut, a string about to snap, and the collective, morbid curiosity of the onlookers held it in place. They were about to witness the predictable, brutal conclusion to their little drama. Then the waitress moved. It wasn't a large movement. She simply stepped forward, the mop held loosely at her side. Her voice, when it came, was not loud. It was soft, almost gentle, yet it cut through the thick tension like a surgeon's scalpel. "Please," Eliza said, her eyes on Rico's hand. "Take this outside." The request was so absurd, so out of place, that it broke the spell. Laughter erupted, sharp and derisive. Jinx, still smirking from the water incident, turned on her, his eyes full of malice. He saw an easy target, a way to reassert the dominance she had momentarily challenged. "Oh, look," he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "The clumsy waitress wants to play hero." He took a step toward her and, without another word, shot his hand out, grabbing her upper arm. His fingers dug in, a grip meant to bruise, to punish, to show her her place. He began to yank her toward the door. "Let me show you the way out." It was a fatal miscalculation. For the briefest instant, nothing happened. Jinx's grip was firm, Eliza's body pliant. Then, the universe seemed to shift on its axis. Eliza's body didn't resist his pull. It flowed with it. In a single, fluid motion that seemed to defy the laws of physics, she pivoted on the ball of her foot. Her center of gravity dropped. His forward momentum became her weapon. His arm, still clamped onto hers, was no longer pulling her, but was now caught in a lock he couldn't comprehend. There was a sickening, wet pop. The diner didn't just go quiet. Sound itself was erased. In the vacuum of noise, Jinx's scream was unnaturally loud as he was slammed, face first, onto the grimy linoleum floor. His arm was bent at an angle it was never meant to take. He let out a choked groan and lay still, his cheek pressed against a sticky spot where someone had spilled syrup hours ago. Eliza let go and straightened up. Her hands were loose at her sides. She didn't look down at the man she had just incapacitated. She didn't look at anyone. She just stood there, her posture transformed. The tired slump was gone, replaced by a perfectly balanced, ready stance. The downcast, hesitant eyes were gone, replaced by irises of cold, analytical focus. The clumsy waitress had vanished. In her place stood a stranger, a woman whose every line radiated a quiet, terrifying competence. For a full 3 seconds, the diner was a photograph. Forks were frozen halfway to mouths. Brenda's jaw was agape, her perfectly painted lips forming a silent O. Kayla's phone, still recording, wobbled in her trembling hand. Silas Thorne leaned forward in his booth, his own predicament forgotten. A jolt went through him, a shock of pure, unadulterated awe. He hadn't been imagining it. The spilled water, the steady gaze, it was all real. He wasn't watching a waitress anymore. He was watching a weapon. The spell broke. The remaining 3 mercenaries, seeing their comrade on the floor, reacted on pure instinct. The biggest one, a brute with a buzz cut, let out a roar and grabbed the nearest solid object, a heavy wooden chair. He swung it like a club, aiming for Eliza's head. She didn't jump back. She didn't even flinch. She simply took one precise step to the left. The chair whistled through the space where her head had been a millisecond before and crashed into an empty table with explosive force. Plates and glasses shattered, sending shards flying across the floor. Before he could recover his balance from the force of his own swing, the second man, a lanky mercenary with a snake tattoo coiling up his neck, lunged forward. A 6-inch blade appeared in his hand, the dull diner lights glinting off its edge. The remaining customers screamed, a wave of panic finally breaking them free from their paralysis. They scrambled for the door, tripping over each other in their haste. "She's going to get us all killed," Gus yelled, his face pale with terror as he stumbled over a fallen chair. Eliza moved like smoke. She sidestepped the knife thrust, her hand darting out not to block the blade, but to clamp onto the lanky man's wrist. She twisted hard. There was a sharp crack of bone, and the knife clattered uselessly to the floor. As he recoiled in agony, she used his own momentum to spin him around and send him crashing into the buzz-cut mercenary. The third, a stocky man with a thick beard, tried to be clever. He circled around, attempting to grab her from behind. It was a textbook move against an amateur. Eliza was no amateur. Without looking, she dropped low, her body coiling like a spring, and swept her leg out from under him. He went down with a heavy thud that shook the floorboards. It took less than 10 seconds. 3 trained men, down. The diner was a wreck. Broken plates, spilled coffee, and overturned chairs littered the floor like the aftermath of a small earthquake. Kayla was still filming, her phone shaking violently. The excited, mocking tone was gone from her voice, replaced by a choked, terrified whisper. "Oh my God, oh my God. She just... What is happening?" Rico, the leader, had not moved. He stood frozen by the booth, his hands still clenched on the torn fabric of Silas's jacket. He stared at the carnage, at his entire team neutralized by one woman in a faded apron. His professional arrogance had evaporated, replaced by a primal, chilling fear. He wasn't looking at a person, he was looking at an impossibility. His eyes widened, a flicker of horrified recognition dawning within them. He took an involuntary step back, his voice a raw, disbelieving whisper that was terrifyingly clear in the sudden silence. That's Aegis Protocol." The words hung in the air, heavy and incomprehensible to the few terrified customers who remained huddled by the exit. "Impossible," Rico breathed, shaking his head. "That can't be." The unit was disbanded, wiped from the records. In his booth, Silas finally stood, his eyes locked on Eliza. Aegis Protocol. A ghost. A Black Ops unit so secret that even the highest echelons of the CIA denied its existence. They were legends, whispered about in intelligence circles, a team of elite, untouchable operatives who handled threats no one else could. They had reportedly been decommissioned years ago, after a mission went catastrophically wrong. And one of them was serving coffee in a roadside diner. Rico knew he was outmatched. The fight was over before it had truly begun. He was a soldier, a good one, but she was something else entirely. She was a legend made flesh. A cornered animal has only one response when faced with a superior predator. His hand moved with desperate speed, diving inside his jacket. There was a soft metallic scrape. He pulled out a compact, matte black handgun. The remaining customers screamed, a raw, piercing sound of pure terror. Brenda and Tiff dove under their table. The quiet diner had now become a kill zone. Rico's hand was steady, the fear in his eyes replaced by a cold, deadly resolve. He leveled the gun, its black eye unwavering, as it pointed directly at the center of Eliza's chest. The quiet, clumsy waitress was gone. The deadly operative stood before him, but even a legend could be killed by a bullet. The gun was a black hole in the center of the room, swallowing all sound, all light, all hope. The few remaining customers were no longer watching a spectacle. They were hostages in a life-or-death confrontation. Rico's finger tightened on the trigger, his desperation a palpable force. He would not be the one to fall. But Eliza Vance was not looking at the gun. She was looking at Rico's wrist, at the precise arrangement of bone and sinew, at the vulnerable cluster of nerves that controlled his grip. Her eyes, cold and calculating, registered the angle, the distance, the velocity required. Her hand, which had been hanging loosely at her side, blurred into motion. It was not a punch or a block. It was a flick of the wrist, a movement so fast it was almost subliminal. A heavy metal spoon, the one she had been holding from the counter, flew through the air. It didn't tumble. It spun on its axis like a perfectly thrown knife, a silver streak of impossible physics. It crossed the 10 feet between them in the blink of an eye and struck Rico's wrist with a sickening thwack. The impact was brutally precise. Nerves screamed, bones shuddered, and his fingers spasmed open involuntarily. The gun fired. The explosion was deafening in the confined space. A woman shrieked, but the bullet went wide, shattering the large plate glass window at the front of the diner. Cold night air rushed in, carrying the scent of rain and asphalt. Before the echo of the gunshot had faded, before Rico could even process the searing pain in his wrist, Eliza was on him. She moved not like a person, but like a force of nature, covering the distance in 2 silent, predatory steps. She grabbed his gun arm, twisted it behind his back, and slammed him against the wall. The gun, now useless in his numb hand, clattered to the floor. She kicked it away with a neat, precise motion, sending it skittering under a booth. Her forearm was pressed against his throat, cutting off his air. He choked, his eyes wide with a terror that went beyond the fear of death. It was the fear of the incomprehensible. "No way," he gasped, his voice a ragged wheeze. Phoenix was disbanded. Eliza's face was inches from his. Her voice was a whisper, colder than the night air pouring through the broken window. "Phoenix never disbanded," she said. "It just went dark." The diner was dead silent now, the only sound, the ragged, panicked breathing of the man pinned against the wall. Silas stood by his booth, the torn collar of his jacket forgotten. He was looking at Eliza, not with shock, but with a dawning, profound respect. He had spent his life surrounded by power, but he had never seen anything like this. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice soft but urgent. She didn't answer. She just held Rico there, her grip unyielding, a statue of absolute control. And then, from a dark corner booth that had gone unnoticed in the chaos, a woman stood up. She was in a nurse's uniform, her face etched with exhaustion, but her eyes burned with a righteous fire. It was Mrs. Albright. She had been quietly sipping her coffee, a silent witness to the entire ugly affair. Now, her silence was over. Her voice, though trembling with anger, cut through the diner like a blade. "You people are disgusting," she said, her glare sweeping over Brenda and Tiff, who were peeking out from under their table, and Gus, who was flattened against the far wall. "Absolutely disgusting." She took a step forward, her hands clenched into fists. "You don't know him. You don't know her. You sat there, filming and laughing and judging, like this was some kind of show for your entertainment. You mocked their clothes, their jobs, their very existence, because it made you feel powerful for 5 minutes." She turned to Eliza, her eyes softening. "You did what no one else had the courage to do. You protected someone. Don't you let them make you feel small for it." The nurse's words hung in the air, a powerful indictment that shifted the very atmosphere of the room. Shame, hot and unwelcome, crept onto the faces of the accusers. Brenda slowly lowered her phone, its screen suddenly feeling obscene. Just then, the front door burst open. They didn't storm in with sirens and shouting. They flowed in, a silent, disciplined tide of black tactical gear. There were 6 of them, their movements sharp, practiced, utterly professional. They didn't draw weapons. They didn't need to. They moved with an aura of lethal authority that was more intimidating than any gun. In seconds, they had Rico and his incapacitated men in flex cuffs, their efficiency a stark contrast to the preceding chaos. A tall man with silver-gray hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from stone stepped forward. His eyes, the color of slate, locked on to Eliza. He came to a halt a few feet from her, clicked his heels together, and gave a sharp, formal nod of his head. "Orders received. Commander Vance," he said. His voice was a low, respectful baritone. "Commander." The word hit the diner like a shockwave. Brenda's phone slipped from her nerveless fingers and clattered to the floor. Tiff gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Gus's face went from pale to a ghastly shade of white. Carl, the manager, stood frozen behind the counter, his mouth hanging open like a broken hinge. The entire, petty, judgmental world they had constructed had not just been cracked. It had been utterly annihilated. The clumsy waitress they had scorned was a commander. The deadbeat they had mocked was being protected by a ghost unit. They weren't just wrong. They were fools of a magnitude they couldn't begin to comprehend. Eliza did not return the salute. She simply gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, stepping back as the operatives took control. The aftermath was quiet and swift. The red-nailed woman's video, which she had already posted with the caption, "Crazy Waitress Fight in Diner, Number Psycho," was taken down within an hour. Her account was suspended 20 minutes after that for policy violations. When she tried to protest on other platforms, her posts mysteriously vanished. By the end of the month, her lucrative influencer deal with a makeup brand was gone, her emails to the company left unanswered. Gus was handed a pink slip at the auto shop 2 days later. His boss wouldn't meet his eye, just mumbled something about restructuring and pointed to the door. Word was, the shop's biggest and most discreet client, a holding company no one had ever heard of, had made a quiet call. Kayla's video got her a different kind of attention. A local news outlet picked it up, not to showcase the crazy waitress, but as an example of the cruelty of cyberbullying. Her name was tied to the story. Her school made her attend a mandatory workshop on digital ethics, and her phone was confiscated by her mortified mother for a month. She stopped posting after that, her brief, ugly taste of internet fame leaving a bitter residue. A week later, Silas Thorne returned to the diner. He wore a perfectly tailored suit, and his boots were polished to a mirror shine. He didn't sit. He stood at the counter where Eliza was wiping away a spill. He didn't speak of that night. He simply placed a plain white envelope on the counter. "For your trouble," he said. his voice quiet but steady. "Perhaps that night I didn't just survive. Maybe I found the one person I can truly trust." He turned and left. Later, alone in the kitchen, Eliza opened the envelope. There was no money. Inside was a single, heavy, metallic key and a slip of paper with an address. It wasn't a question or an offer. It was a statement. A safe house. A resource. A recognition. As the operatives were leading the last of the mercenaries out, a quiet, older man who had been reading a newspaper in a corner booth the whole time folded it neatly and stood up. It was Mr. Corbin. He walked over to Eliza, his steps slow and deliberate, and placed a single, elegant business card on the counter. It was made of thick, black stock with no name or number. Just a simple, embossed logo. A shield rising like a phoenix from ashes. He looked at her, his eyes knowing and kind. "You're never really out, Commander," he said softly. "Not really." Then he turned and walked out, the bell jingling softly behind him. Eliza's hand hovered over the card, and for the first time that night, her fingers trembled. She didn't pick it up immediately. She just stared at it, her jaw tight, before slipping it into her apron pocket with the key. The diner was quiet now. She picked up her cloth and turned back to her work, wiping down the counters. Same apron, same ponytail, same steady hands. But everything had changed. She was still Eliza Vance, the waitress, but she was also Commander Vance of the Aegis Protocol. And the Crossroads Diner was no longer her prison. It was her watchtower.